Good evening. Hello. Next week, it will be 2 years since Martin died. So I'm very happy that we're finally getting together here in New York, his adopted home. Thanks to Lucas Whitman. And thanks to Lucas also for his idea to dedicate the proceeds from the tickets tonight to a future evening in Martin's honor, one celebrating new voices in criticism. I was thinking we could maybe keep that going. One night on criticism, and then, of course, another on fiction, and after a decent interval, a memoir night, perhaps, a screenplay night, and maybe a genre night, perhaps on the detective novel, or, of course, writing the Holocaust, and maybe one inspired by Martin's often overlooked contribution to science fiction. One can dream. And here we are tonight. Thank you for coming. I can't see you at all, so there's that. Every reader of a Martin Amis novel settles down to it with at least this question in mind. When will something truly horrible and humiliating happen to this man or this woman, the main character, and how bad will it get? Because there's going to be a comeuppance, a series of dreadful punishments, and even when things are going reasonably well, there's always, at the very least, the ruthless pressure of time. From his early 20s, Martin was alert to and pitiless about the hallmarks of age. And it's a hallmark of his confidence as a novelist that he always took his own experiences and feelings to be universal. So in the Rachel Papers, he gave us a sex-obsessed, self-loathing teenager, plenty of youthful embarrassment, exposure, and mortification in the early novels, Dead Babies, Success, but also in The Pregnant Widow, which he published at 61. He was younger than that when he casually asked, sitting down to breakfast, freshly showered and shaved, "Have you ever noticed that the shampoo's getting colder every year?" Middle age was certainly his quarry in The Information, and already a subject in London Fields, which he wrote in his 30s. And of course, his memoir experience is all about the main events in midlife. Martin was no less searing about old age, even though he barely touched his own. I'm going to read just a few paragraphs on that from his final novel, Inside Story, a book he called blindingly autobiographical, and whose main character is called Martin. This is from a section called The Struggle for Coffee. And in the book, I should say, these paragraphs appear over 6 or 7 pages, so if it's at all choppy, that is not Martin's fault. "I want my grande crème," she said. He said, "I want my double espresso." Making their intention quite plain, this enviably, indeed nauseatingly, compatible pair stepped out of the hotel and turned right towards the Croisette and the Atlantic Ocean. She said, "Oh my God, the heat, the people." It was certainly a warm day on the coast of Brittany. And there were certainly people everywhere. Festival goers and writers and publishers and representatives of the media, and also families, large families, pressing coastward. Their pace was slowed in forced deference to an unusual concentration of pedestrians. Unusual demographically, that is. One often saw children en masse, but Martin wondered if he had ever seen such an army, such a serried host of seniors. These ancient parties, these Decembrists, were inching their way along the narrow strip between the house fronts and the curbside barriers. All this was clearly going to take a very long time. He said, "How did it happen? We stepped out for a simple and honest cup of coffee, and now we're trapped in this incredible operation with all these elderly." Yes, his concise Oxford dictionary was behind the game with elderly, confining itself to adjective, old and aging person. In America nowadays, they confidently used elderly as a noun. The guy freaked out in the hospital, for example, and gunned down 3 elderly. "I want my cappuccino," said Elena, "and I keep wondering how old I'm going to be when I get there." "Me too," he said, "but you'll still be reasonably young. I'll be an elderly." He was 53. Sensory adjustments to the new order of being were already well underway. For some time, he'd been aware that, in his outward guise, he was physically undetectable to anyone under the age of 35. In the year 2000 in Uruguay, he'd gone to a nightclub in search of a young cousin, and he realized something. He was the invisible man. The young had stopped seeing him, and now, in dubious recompense, he saw afresh that hitherto invisible population, the seriously old. I'm skipping a couple of pages here to the next section called "The Continuing Struggle for Coffee." Nothing had changed. "What we're in," he said, "is no longer just an emergency. It's a humanitarian crisis, a deepening humanitarian crisis. I want my coffee. I want my coffee," sang Elena to the tune of "I Want My Potty." "Christ," she said. She meant all the oldsters, the slowly and tremulously bobbing coachloads of oldsters. Their numbers had at last begun to thin, and there was a loose sense of calibrated delay, as in a stacked aircraft groaning high above the tarmac, with the captain coming on to say that they were 9th in line for landing. The coachloads of oldsters continued to filter through the gap, stiffly upright, the feet moving in soft shoe shuffle, no space admitted between the cobble and sole. Every few seconds they glanced at one another to give encouragement, or to seek mutual recognition, or mutual verification. On they edged, their faces flickering not just with discomfort, difficulty, and mistrust, but also with innumerable calculations, every step measured on a scale of soreness, effort, and jeopardy. Looking beyond them, beyond their denim-clad shoulders, their pinions of cloud-white hair, their ears furry in the sun, Martin saw that the next stretch of road seemed reverse telescoped, and the next junction felt implausibly remote, like gate 97E in a Texan airport. The elderly were making him think of planes and the poetry of departures. Here we are on our journey. Is it far? Are we nearly there?
Way back in the 90s, while I was having a drink with a literary editor, I mentioned my dream of someday meeting Martin Amis. "Oh, you don't want to meet Amos," the editor said. "He's always got a drink in his hand, and every word that comes out of his mouth is just so polished and so clever. Every thought he's had since Oxford, he's worked up into an apercu. It's like talking to Bartlett's." I could go for that, I said. 20 years later, I got the chance. At a literary festival in Brazil, I was standing with a group of other writers when I saw Martin Amis slowly approaching. Famously short, his fame enlarged him. The impression I had was of a shadow falling over us, as when a giant blocks out the sun. On reaching us, he smiled genially and said in a plummy voice, "Good morrow." Just as advertised, here was the author of The War Against Cliché, and he wouldn't even reuse "good morning." Because our young daughters played together during that trip, I got to spend a lot of time in Martin's company, and I understood what the literary editor hadn't. Sure, Martin was witty, learned, and clever, but the brilliance of his cocktail conversation was merely the afterglow of the supernova that went off in his study every day. You just couldn't spend your day writing at his level and go around speaking like everyone else. And so, as the years passed, if I heard some of the same stories again or laughed at the same excellent jokes, the experience was no less pleasurable than reading or rereading one of Martin's books. Importantly, if Martin didn't have anything interesting to say, he said nothing. In company, he seemed to rouse himself from his own thoughts to join the party, and he did so only to enliven the festivities rather than to get attention. No matter how convivial or funny he was, you always knew that he'd rather be working. To a large degree, I never knew him. Not really. This is tribute number 2. The first one was last year, a memorial at St. Martin in the Fields with all of literary London in attendance. Tonight's the American celebration, fitting for a writer who liked American writers so much. Martin picked up the jumpy, high-octane rhythms of Bellow and others and made them his own. Then he injected them into British prose, and as we read them over here, he influenced us. That's the way it used to work. Free cultural trade without a 10% tariff. Long before toxic became attached to the word, Martin said his subject, writ large, was masculinity. Martin's heroes were scoundrels, petty thieves, Nazis, and novelists. A rogues gallery, if there ever was one. Being confused with one's characters is an occupational hazard for fiction writers. This made it all the easier for his antagonists, whenever Martin made an unfashionable statement in the press, to mistake his courage for political or moral malfeasance. Everyone knew about Martin's acid wit and his savage, satirical eye. What escaped his popular reputation was what a sweetheart he was. One example will stand for all. On leaving Brazil, it turned out that my daughter had left behind her favorite stuffed animal, a white cat named, owing to the influence of her Detroit-born father, Cadillac. I sent Martin an email asking if he'd seen it around the house he and Isabel were renting. A few days later, a package arrived at our apartment in Chicago, haphazardly wrapped, illegibly addressed. It bore a raft of colorful Brazilian stamps to whose seeping glue copious cigarette ash adhered. Clearly, Martin's handiwork. And that amazed me, that this great writer, busy with his family and his own work, rather than delegating the errand to a festival assistant, had wrapped the package himself, taken it to a post office in the jungle, and waited in line to fill out the customs declarations needed to send it airmail to the U.S., all because he knew how important it was to restore Cadillac to its bereft 4-year-old owner. I'm religious, and Martin wasn't. I once asked him if he'd ever, as a youth or in extremis, even for a minute, experienced one spasm of religious feeling. Raising his voice for emphasis, he replied, "No." What Martin had instead of faith was a resolute British stoicism. He loved America, he lived in America, he married an American, But when it came to whining and self-pity, Martin lacked that can-do American spirit. After he got sick, he didn't talk about it. He certainly didn't write about it. In general, he preferred to recede, to sequester himself with his family. From what Isabel has told me, he died as rationally composed as he'd lived and as peacefully as a saint. Of his smoking, Martin once told me, "It takes maybe 10 years off your life, but they're not the best 10, are they?" He also said that no one writes anything any good after the age of 70. Maybe he was right about all that, but those of us who remain wouldn't have minded more time with a less eloquent Martin living out inferior years. Martin also said, "Writers die twice," meaning they lose the ability to write and then life itself. But there's another thing that happens, the only kind of resurrection Martin could believe in, and which he claimed was impermanent itself. "You'll be reading me every now and then, at least until 2080, weather permitting," he wrote in his last book, Inside Story. That posterity is no longer speculative. It's why we're all here tonight. The time is now, and the weather's fine. You'll be reading me every now and then, until about 2080. So, let's begin.
I'll be reading to you from the Rachel Papers, which was Martin's first novel. From the beginning. 7 o'clock, Oxford. My name is Charles Highway, though you wouldn't think it to look at me. It's such a rangy, well-traveled, big-cocked name, and to look at, I'm none of these. I wear glasses for a start, have done since I was 9, and my medium-length, arseless, waistless figure, corrugated ribcage, and bandy legs gang up to dispel any hint of aplomb. On no account, by the way, should this particular model be confused with the springy frames so popular among my contemporaries. They're quite different. I remember I used to have to fold the bands of my trousers almost double and bulk out the seats with shirts intended for grown men. I dress more thoughtfully now, though not so much with taste as with insight. But I have got one of those fashionable reedy voices, the ones with the habitual ironic twang, excellent for the promotion of oldster unease. And I imagine there's something oddly daunting about my face, too. It's angular, yet delicate. Thin, long nose, wide, thin mouth, and the eyes, richly lashed, dark ochre, with a twinkle of singed auburn. Ah, how inadequate these words seem. The main thing about me, however, is that I am 19 years of age, and 20 tomorrow. 20, of course, is the real turning point. 16, 18, 21, those are arbitrary milestones, enabling you only to get arrested for HP, payment evasion, get married, buggered, executed, and so on. External things. Naturally, one avoids, like the plague, such mischievous doctrines as "you're only as young as you feel," which doubtless resulted in many trim 50-year-olds flopping down dead in their tracksuits, haggard hippies checking out on overdoses, precarious queers getting their caps and crowns stomped by bestial hitchhikers. 20 may not be the start of maturity, but in all conscience, it's the end of youth. To achieve at once dramatic edge and thematic symmetry, I elect to place my time of birth on the stroke of midnight. In fact, my mother's was a prolix and generally inelegant parturition. She went into labor about now, i.e., 7 p.m., December 5th, 20 years ago, not to come out of it again until past 12, the result being a moist 4-pound waif that had to be taken to hospital for a fortnight's priming. My father had attended Christ knows why to watch the whole thing, but got browned off after a couple of hours. I've long been sure that there is a great significance in this anecdote, and although I've never been able to track it down, perhaps I will find the answer at the moment at which, 2 decades earlier, I first sniffed the air. I confess that I've been looking forward to tonight for months. I thought when Rachel turned up about half an hour ago that she was going to ruin it all, but she left in time. I need to make the transition decorously, officially, and to re-experience the tail end of my youth, because something has definitely happened to me, and I'm very keen to know what it is. So if I run through, let's say, the last 3 months, and if I try to sort out all of my precocity and childishness, my sixth form cleverness, my fifth form nastiness, all the self-consciousness, self-disgust, and self-infatuation, and you name it, perhaps I'll be able to locate my hamarta and see what kind of grown-up I shall make, or not, as the case may be. Anyway, it ought to be good fun. Now, let me see. It's just gone 7, 5 hours of teenage to go. 5 hours and I wander into the noisome, Brobdingnagian world that a child sees at adulthood. I snap open my stinky black suitcase and upend it on the bed, folders, notepads, files, bulging manila envelopes, wads of paper trussed in spring, letters, carbons, diaries, the marginalia of my youth cover the patchwork quilt. I jostle the papers into makeshift stacks. Ought they be arranged chronologically by subject or theme? Patently, some rigorous clerking must have to be done tonight, and at random, I pick up a diary, cross the room, and lean against the bookcase, which creaks. I sip my wine and turn the page. The second weekend in September. At that point, I'd only gone a couple of days home to endure what I would call going down to London. It was on the Thursday that my father, drinking spirits for the first time in years, had wondered why I didn't have a crack at getting into Oxford. And I nodded back at him, wondering, why not, too? I was going to have a year off before university anyway. My English master had always impressed upon me how fucking clever I was. I didn't particularly want to go anywhere else. It seemed logical. Mother got all bustly the next morning, fixing everything up, but then became vague and spiritual over lunch and resolved to take an afternoon nap. When I asked her what there was left to do, she free associated until it became clear, as a jigsaw becomes clear, that she had succeeded only in telling my sister that I would be coming to stay. And one assumes giving her the usual half-hour rundown on the perils of late menopause and other such female smut. So I said, I ring the Oxford admissions and the UCCA and the tutors? Mother left the kitchen with one hand flat on her forehead and the other suspended in the air behind her. Yes, dear, she called. It took about an hour because I'm surprisingly ineffective on the telephone. I spoke to key tarts in the university administration complex and finally got on to the tutors, where a shifty dotard told me it wasn't for him personally to say, but he was fairly sure they would be able to fit me in. I realized then that I was half hoping for some insurmountable snag, like entrance date, yet all seemed to be going forward. I don't know why I hoped this. Oxford meant more work. Of course, that was no problem. It meant more exams, but again, I rather like having definite horizons, foreseeable crunches, a focus for my anxieties. Perhaps as a person, I like to think structurally about his life. I'd plan the next few months until my 20th birthday with all this in mind. There were still several teenage things to get done. Get a job, preferably menial, egalitarian, have a first love, or at least sleep with an older woman, write a few more callow, brittle poems, thus completing my adolescent monologue sequence, and, well, just marshal my childhood. There's also a less precious explanation. My family lives near Oxford, so if I went there, I should have to spend more time at home. Furthermore, I dislike the town. Sorry. Too many butterfly trendies, upper-class cunts, regional yobs with faces like gravy dinners, and the streets are so affectedly narrow.
I'm going to say a few words about Martin Amis's novel, Money, which was published in the US in the spring of 1985, so exactly 40 years ago. So this is its American 40th anniversary. I encountered Martin Amis only a few times in my life. Our paths crossed briefly, inconsequentially. The first was in a hotel lobby in New York early in this century, and he was en famille, seated with his wife and children and happy as a clam or a lark. Perhaps he would prefer the word lark. They were eating breakfast. I had never seen a man so content to eat in the daytime with his family in a hotel lobby. His fine face, with its dash of Rudolf Nureyev, struck me in an unforgettable and tender way. He found his children genuinely and endlessly amusing, and there was much smiling and chatter and energy among them. The second time I saw him was backstage somewhere in a green room, also in New York, and he was all alone, staring blindly into the middle distance, looking stricken. He was apparently in mourning for his friend Christopher Hitchens, who had recently died. "Martin is the real widow in a sense," said the friend I was with. I didn't question this. We moved gingerly through the room and left him to his solitary grief. The third time our paths crossed, Amos was presenting a Lifetime Achievement Award to the crime novelist Elmore Leonard at a book ceremony. This honor was to come at the end of a long awards evening, so Leonard beforehand was outside a lot in the Cipriani foyer taking smoking breaks. I joined him 3 times. Amos was twice on Leonard's other side. To smoke cigarettes with Elmore Leonard was exhilarating because at 86, thin, spry, lively, and sharp, he gave you the impression that smoking might be good for you. Alas, Elmore Leonard was dead within a year. At the end of the night, presenting the award, Amos was the hit of the evening, very master of ceremonies, droll, charismatic, calm in his tuxedo and reading glasses. If he'd ever really been the bad literary lad of London, that quality had aged gracefully to a faint inflection. He described Leonard's particular use of the present participle as the marijuana tense. People leaned sideways in their chairs, laughing with pleasure. The very last time I saw him, or seemed to see him, was on a friend's cell phone in Berlin. I was on a walk through Kreuzberg on a breezy May afternoon. My friend gasped and held up his phone. The lit screen exclaimed the first early news of Martin Amos's death with a large, beautiful photograph of him. I too gasped. It had been so quick. The life, the mortal illness, the passing. Amos had seemed like someone imbued with eternal youth. His dying was a shock. The reader of the novel Money will also encounter Martin Amos several times. That is, the book has a character by that name, who is also a writer, who makes a few cameo appearances and has conversations with the narrator, an Englishman by way of New Jersey named John Self. One assumes this means the commode self, the toilet self. He is a director of commercials. In London, he would be named Lou. Thank you for laughing. This is well before the word autofiction entered the literary world. Martin Amos's presence in the pages, he is mostly writing, reading, drinking coffee, and briefly convinced to revise a screenplay, probably wouldn't qualify as autofiction, but perhaps as a nod to its future existence. Amos's final novel, The Inside Story, is a more approximate example of that genre. The character Martin Amos in Money serves as a reminder to John Self that writing books is the real deal and that Hollywood is a hot potato world of cash flow and what might be thought of as fiscal sting operations. Martin Amos, as fashioned in this book by Martin Amos, is a kind of conscience as well as a plaything. Well, in the world of this novel, all consciences are playthings. Amos's novel was published in the UK in the previous autumn, so the same autumn as J. McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City. And both books register the overtaking of New York by the cash-fueled hedonism of Reagan-era rat race economics. each featuring a narrator who is constantly surprised by what is happening to him, but inclined to pretend otherwise. "You are not the kind of guy who would be at a place like this," begins Bright Lights, Big City. "This is a suicide note," begins Money. Both narratives are looking around at an urban circus of drugs and transactional entertainment. Prostitution is a metaphor and not. Both protagonists have personal sadnesses shallowly buried. Their endless bad dream state speaks to the shock of the 1980s to those brought up in the more idealistic preceding decades, even for those who were white, male, and privileged. Here is Amos's John Self. "We talked money. Let me tell you about it," he began, and he was off and away, his voice full of passionate connoisseurship, with many parallels and precedents: Italian banking, liquidity preference, composition fallacy, hyperinflation, business confidence syndrome booms and panics, U.S. corporations, the sobriety of financial architecture, the bust of 29, the suicides on LaSalle and Wall Street. And I found myself wondering whether Alec has seen the single dead flower in the jam jar beside Selena's bed. Oh, the single flower in the jam jar. That it comes so soon after the words Wall Street is the brilliance of juxtaposition that serves as surrealism, terror, and heartbroken wool gathering. All these are used to utmost effect in Amos's writing. And although every conversation between two people eventually makes its way to money, shining there like the La Brea tar pits of the soul, once in a while there are soliloquies in Money that trek off elsewhere. "Look at my life. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but it's terrific, it's great. You're thinking, some guys have all the luck. Well, I suppose it might look quite cool. What with the airline tickets and the restaurants, the cabs, the film stars, Selena, the fiasco, the money. But my life is also my private culture. That's what I'm showing you, after all. That's what I'm letting you into, my private culture. And I mean, look at my private culture. Look at the state of it. It really isn't very nice in here. And that is why I long to burst out of the world of money and into what? Into the world of thought and fascination. How do I get there? Tell me, please. I'll never make it by myself." John Self's voice in this novel is a cry, sometimes a kind of free jazz of self-pity and ecstatic observation. There is plenty of caffeinated meditation laced with sour, propulsive wit. His world is in a condition of overcast frolic, and much is very funny. Self describes his own tennis serve as no more than a convulsion. He uses da the way Homer Simpson uses do. Self ostensibly spent his teen years in New Jersey, but his knowledge of Manhattan geography proves vague. Amos has Broadway zigging and zagging instead of proceeding as it does as a diagonal across the island, a bishop on a chessboard. The whereabouts of Chelsea and Times Square seem to shift. And he also registers much surprise at American weather. In New York, in July, the heat is psychopathic. On bucking Broadway, the cabs all bitched and beef, ferrying robots, bad dogs, uptown, downtown. Amos famously desired a high style to describe low things, and one is reminded in his work of the exquisite patches of Bellow's own The Adventures of Augie March, a book Amos much admired. Amos thought of Money as something of an American novel, but with its English delicacy and other contradictions, it is a curious hybrid, as is its narrator. Mostly this novel involves the riffing registration of a world, or several overlapping worlds, and of an era that marked the beginning of the time we are in now. The book houses the electrified wail of a wounded, vamping resident within that world. This is what gives the novel its beat of vital life. A reader can sometimes feel bullied by literary resolution and sensible shape, inert tales of the heroic, whole, and strong. We sometimes need to hear the trials of the comedically weak and appreciate the music embedded in those. This is one of the things Martin Amis did so well. Thank you.
Good evening. One definition of literary value might be the number of any given writer's phrases or images that appear unbidden in the mind as you're just walking down the street. For me, Amisian jokes and tags have for a long time made up part of the useful poetry of existence. When I'm bored or otherwise unhappy about reviewing another book, those wicked lines about the book reviewer Richard Tull from Martin Amis's novel, The Information, swing into view. Quote, "He was very good at book reviewing. When he reviewed a book, it stayed reviewed." Whenever I see a photograph of Saul Bellow, I recall with a smile Amis's description of the American novelist as looking like an omniscient tortoise. City pigeons with their dirty grey necks like hoods. The wonderfully silly sentence from Amis's novel London Fields comes to mind. The pigeons waddled by in their criminal balaclavas. Or what about that beautiful and completely funny description, complexly funny description, from the memoir Experience, of how Martin's large ailing father, Kingsley Amis, fell to the ground on the Edgware Road in London. Quote, "And this was no brisk trip or tumble. It was a work of colossal administration." Over the years in our household, as my wife and I witnessed our own large ailing fathers fail and fall, how many times did we recite to each other as rueful comfort, as stinging recognition, and as saving comedy, those words, a work of colossal administration? Amis's style combined many of the classic elements of English literary comedy: exaggeration and its dry parent understatement, picaresque farce, caustic authorial intervention, caricature and grotesquerie, a wonderful ear, above all, for ironic registration. Take that phrase, a work of colossal administration. Sterne, Fielding, Austen, above all, I think Jane Austen, might have recognized its mixture of cruelty and mercy. The Austen of Emma, for instance, that satirist who describes the irritating Mrs. Elton's large bonnet and basket as her apparatus of happiness, would have seen exactly what Amis is doing here. To fall to the ground massively, slowly, is an act of labor that wins from the writer that cumbersome word, administration. And the cool Latinate tease of it is funny. But it also hints more tenderly at what will be needed of us, our administration, as we struggle to lift the almost dead weight up off the street. The entire drawling phrase ironically distances something that's unbearably painful and intimate. Or take as another example, another line from Experience that I often think smilingly of. It's a sentence about traveling with Martin's friend Christopher Hitchens and how the two men had to stop regularly for, quote, "the many powerful drinks and the huge uneaten meal without which the hitch could not long subsist." That's sort of B-grade Amis, not especially flashy by his standards. But note the way that powerfully drinking and hugely not eating comically balance and cancel each other out, and how the genius is all in that little word, long, the huge uneaten meal without which the hitch could not long subsist, with its absurd logical contradiction of Hitchens subsisting, no, needing to subsist, on huge uneaten meals. On page after page of Amis's work, you find this kind of attention to the comic music to the careful, sardonic orchestration, sounded and built up word by word, that constituted his brilliant style. Despite his vows and avowals, I'm not sure that Martin Amis ever sounded much like a Jewish-American novelist who was almost born in Russia, Saul Bellow, or a Russian novelist who emigrated into his own estranged English, Vladimir Nabokov. He sounded like a funny English writer, very keen not to sound like his father, the comic novelist Kingsley Amis. And this was all the delight his readers needed or wanted. The writer who so persistently wrote about the moronic inferno of the modern, pornography, urban dreck, America, the brutal state of the British nation, whose novels seem to abound in postmodern tricks, a novel, as we just heard, with a character named Martin Amis, a novel told backwards, walk-on parts for characters, wasn't really modern at all. Stylistically, he came cackling and chortling right out of the 18th century. In fact, the modern writer Amis most obviously resembles, I think, was quite far from the high pantheon of Bellow and Nabokov, though one admired by both Amis and Hitchens. That muscleless magician, that popular purveyor of timeless comic fertility and posh silliness, P.G. Wodehouse. The clues were littered all over Amis's work. His first major novel, Money, posed as an Englishman's wised-up attempt to do mid-1980s New York, seen as a hellish but alluring island of strip clubs, pornography, and simmering racial unease. But the New York of Money isn't really Tom Wolfe's painstakingly reported dystopia of the same era. It's an invented universe, a world stripped of reference and filled with in-jokes and mad wordplay. In Amis's novel, for instance, the city's hotels are all teasingly named after literary models: the Ashbury, the Bartleby, the Cymbeline. Wodehouse invented a magical alternative slang for ordinary objects, a kind of upper-class Martian estrangement. In his Jeeves and Wooster stories, the head becomes the onion, the lemon, the bean, the coconut. I was still massaging the coconut. A beard is fungus. I fiddled with the fungus. The face becomes the map. He had a dazed expression on the map. And so on. In Money, Amis gives words their sillier siblings too. An apartment becomes a sock. Quote, I peer through the spectral, polluted, nicotine-sodden windows of my sock. Hair becomes a rug. His hair was that special mad yellow, like an omelette, a rug omelette. A bachelor pad, or bachelor sock indeed, smells of batch, and so on. Amis wrote a great deal about the decay of the body, about violence, ill health, tawdriness, perversion, and historic nastiness of all kinds, but the atmosphere of systematic and high-spirited comic exaggeration pulls the sting from his reality, most of the time. Quote, refreshed by a brief blackout, I got to my feet and went next door. Quote, wearing only a cigarette, I fetched myself some orange juice. Perhaps there's no real distress or danger in Amis's fictional worlds, only words. America is America, an almost surreal creation. And those of you who knew Martin will know that he could do this in conversation too, magically turn America into invented places. I remember him once talking about a book tour he was doing in Florida, and he was flying to Tampa. He'd flown to Tampa, and he was picked up by a representative of the publishers. And here you have to hear Martin's particular lovely drawl. Martin said, Florida, it's just a mad place, it's just different. The publisher's representative said, I'll meet you curbside in a maroon infinity. It's why his best novel, I think, was almost his most weightless, and the closest he got to replicating the campus farce made famous by his father in Lucky Jim. I mean The Information, his ridiculously funny book about literary rivalry and drudgery. In that novel, the hapless book reviewer Richard Tull, he whose reviewed books stay firmly reviewed, finds himself on a book tour with his old friend and rival Gwyn Barry, a much more successful writer. The two men are doing their book tour in America, and a stray, rapid, rather gorgeous sentence is flourished. to evoke the bewildering variety of bookshop that Richard will encounter in his swing through the States. Quote, "The bookshops he would come to know, the Musact and Morlish, the underlit and wood-panelled and pseudo-Baudelaire, the disco Montparnassian." Only a very, very good comic ear, I think, can hear and invent something on the sublime order of disco Montparnassian. I'm still not quite sure what America did to deserve. I'm not sure what we did to deserve such precise and perfect lavishment.
"22 years before Martin wrote Zone of Interest, he wrote Time's Arrow. That novel follows the life of a Nazi doctor from his death back to his birth. The story is narrated by a voice trapped inside this evil man, probably his helpless soul, watching events unfold backwards without understanding them. Simple actions become strange. Atrocities seem to undo themselves. Smoke turns into dead people, which come alive and leave the camp on packed trains. The time reversal forces us to see the horror in ways we never did before. I once mentioned to Martin that Time's Arrow is my favorite among his books. It makes you ask, I said, whether time is in its substance just the direction of the second law of thermodynamics. "It's not," he answered. "It's the direction of our moral arc." And indeed, the strange fact that timeless morality is always tied to the flow of time has never been explored more brilliantly than in this deeply disturbing masterpiece. The overwhelming majority of women, children, and the elderly we process with gas and fire. The men, of course, as is right, walk a different path to recovery. Arbeit macht frei, says the sign on the gate with typically gruff and undesigning eloquence. The men work for their freedom. There they go now, in the autumn dusk. The male patients in their light pajamas while the band plays. They march in ranks of 5 in their wooden clocks. Look. There's a thing they do with their heads. They bend their heads right back until their faces are entirely open to the sky. I've tried it. I tried to do it, and I can't. There's this fist of flesh at the base of my neck, which the men don't yet have. The men come here awful thin. You can't get a stethoscope to them. The bell bridges on their ribs. Their hearts sound far away. There they go, to the day's work, with their heads bent back. I was puzzled at first, but now I know why they do it, why they stretch their throats like that. They are looking for the souls of their mothers and their fathers, their women and their children, gathering in the heavens, awaiting human form and union. The sky above the Vistula is full of stars. I can see them now. They no longer hurt my eyes. These familial unions and arranged marriages, known as selections on the ramp, were the regular high points of the KZ routine. It is a commonplace to say that the triumph of Auschwitz was essentially organizational. We found the sacred fire that hides in the human heart and built an autobahn that went there. But how to explain the divine synchronies of the ramp At the very moment that the weak and young and old were brought from the sprinkle room to the railway station, as good as new, so their menfolk completed the appointed term of labor service and ventured forth to claim them on the ramp, a trifle disheveled to be sure, but strong and sleek from their regime of hard work and strict diet. As matchmakers, we didn't know the meaning of the word failure. On the ramp, stunning successes were as cheap as spit. When the families coalesced, how their hands and eyes would plead for one another under our indulgent gaze, we toasted them far into the night. One guard, his knees bent and swaying, played an accordion. Actually, we all drank like fiends. The stag party on the ramp and the capos like the groom's best friend, shoving the man into the waiting cart, freshly sprayed with trash and shit for the journey home. The Auschwitz universe, it has to be allowed, was fiercely coprocentric. It was made of shit. In the early months, I still had my natural aversion to overcome before I understood the fundamental strangeness of the process of fruition. Enlightenment was urged on me the day I saw the old Jew float to the surface of the deep latrine, how he splashed and struggled into life and was hoisted out by the jubilant guards, his clothes cleansed by the mire. Then they put his beard back on. I also found it salutary to watch the Scheiße-Kommando about its work. This team had the job of replenishing the ditches from the soil wagon, not with buckets or anything like that, but with flat wooden spades. In fact, a great many of the camp's labor programs were quite clearly unproductive. They weren't destructive either. Fill that hole, dig it up again, shift that, then shift it back. Therapy was the order of the day. The Scheiße-Kommando was made up of our most cultured patients, academics, rabbis, writers, philosophers. As they worked, they sang arias and whistled scraps of symphonies and recited poetry and talked of Heine and Schiller and Goethe. In the officers' club, when we are drinking, which we nearly always are, and where shit is constantly mentioned and invoked, we sometimes refer to Auschwitz as Annus Mundi, and I can think of no finer tribute than that. There are other revealing examples of Camp Argo. The main oven room is called Heaven Block. Its main approach road, Heaven Street. Chamber and sprinkle room are known most mordantly as the Central Hospital. Sommerfrische is our name for a tour of duty here in any season. Summer air suggesting a perennial vacation from an inadequate reality. When we mean never, we say tomorrow morning. It's like the Spanish saying mañana. The slenderest patients, those whose faces are nothing more than a triangle of bone around the eyes, they're Muselmänner. Not, as I first thought, as an ironical glance at muscle man. No, the angularity of hip and shoulder suggests Muslims. Muslims at prayer. Of course, they're not Muslims, they're Jews. Well, we converted them. When will it happen, the conversion of the Jews? Tomorrow morning. The rumor and gossip, which often tend to overexcite the male patients, we leniently designate as latrine talk. Hier ist kein Warum. Disappointingly, my German fails to improve. I speak it and appear to understand it and give and take orders in it, but on some level it just isn't sinking in. My German is no more advanced than my Portuguese. I think it took a lot out of me learning colloquial English. That was my shot. It's a funny language, German. For one thing, everybody shouts it. All those very long words, the literalism, the tinker-toy accumulation. It sounds pushy, even beginning every sentence with a verb like that. And take the first person singular. Ich. Not a masterpiece of reassurance, is it? I sounds nobly erect. Je has a certain strength and intimacy. Io is okay. Yo I can really relate to. Yo. But ich? It's like the sound of a child it's like the sound a child makes when it confronts its own, perhaps that's part of the point. No doubt all will come clear as soon as my German gets better. When will that be? I know. Tomorrow morning.
I'm going to read from the information, which James already beautifully introduced as the story of two old friends who become novelists and go to America on a book tour. This is one of them. The next day, it was his turn. Richard turned 40. Turned is right, like a half-cooked steak, like a wired cop, like an old leaf, like milk. Richard turned, and nothing changed. He was still a wreck. At 28, living off book reviews and Social Security, pale and thin and interestingly dissolute, most typically to be seen wearing a collarless white shirt and jeans tucked into misshapen brown boots, looking like the kind of ex-public schoolboy who perhaps did some drug-impaired carpentering or gardening. For the good and the great, with his fiery politics and his riveting love affairs in which he was usually the crueler, Richard Tull published his first novel, A Forethought, in Britain and America. If you homogenized all the reviews still kept somewhere in a withered envelope, allowing for many grades of generosity and IQ, then the verdict on A Forethought was as follows. Nobody understood it, or even finished it, but equally, nobody was sure it was shit. Richard flourished. He stopped getting Social Security. He appeared on Better Read. The three critics in their breakfast nook, Richard behind a desk with an unseen Gauloise, fuming in his trembling hand. He looked like as though his trousers were on fire. 3 years later, by which time he had become books and arts editor of a little magazine called The Little Magazine, Little Then and Littler Now, Richard published his second novel, Dreams Don't Mean Anything, in Britain but not in America. His third novel wasn't published anywhere. Neither was his fourth. Neither was his fifth. In those three brief sentences, we adumbrate a Mahabharata of pain. He had plenty of offers for his sixth, because by that time, during a period of cretinous urges and lurches, he had started responding to the kind of advertisements that plainly came out with it and said, "We will publish your book." And authors wanted, or was it needed, by London publisher. Of course, these publishers, crying out for words on paper like pining dogs under a plangent moon, weren't regular publishers. You paid them, for example. And perhaps more importantly, no one ever read you. Richard stayed with it and ended up going to see a Mr. Cohen on Marylebone High Street. He came out of there, his sixth novel still unplaced, but with a new job, that of special director of the Tantalus Press, where he went on to work about a day a week, soliciting and marking up illiterate novels, total recall autobiographies in which no one ever went anywhere or did anything, collections of primitive verse, very long laments for dead relatives and pets and plants, crackpot scientific treatises, and increasingly, it seemed to him, found dramatic monologues about manic depression and schizophrenia. Bitter is manageable. Look how we all manage it. But worse happened, and the real trouble began. It was a viscous autumn, and Richard had stopped dating girls. He was married now. And Gina was expecting not just one baby, but two. And the rejection slips were coming in on novel number 4, Invisible Worms. And his overdraft practically trepanned him every time he dared to think about it. Imagine then Richard's delight when his oldest and stupidest friend, Gwyn Barry, announced that his first novel, Summertown, had just been accepted by a leading London house. Summertown? Summertown was about Oxford, where the two writers had met, where they had shared first a set of rooms in the mighty hideousness of Keble College, and later a rude flatlet off Woodstock Road. In Summertown, 20 years ago. 20 years, thought Richard, 40 today. Oh, where had they all gone? Gwyn's first novel was no less autobiographical than most first novels. Richard was in it, clumsily and perfunctorily disguised, still the promiscuous communist with his poetry and his ponytail. But affectionately and even romantically rendered, the Gwyn figure who narrated was wan and Welsh. The sort of character who, according to novelistic convention, quietly does all the noticing, whereas reality usually sees to it that the perspiring mute is just a perspiring mute with nothing to contribute. Still, the Gwyn figure, Richard conceded, was the book's only strength, an authentic dud, a dud insider who brought back hard news from the dud world. The rest of it was pure Trex, fantastically pedestrian. It tried to be touching, but the only touching thing about Summertown was that it thought it was a novel. On publication, it met with modest sales and, Richard again, disgracefully unmalicious reviews. The following year, a small paperback edition limped into view for a month or two. We might have said that Richard was tasting fresh failure, except that failure is never fresh, and always stale and weakly fizzes like old yogurt. With his 6th novel, when Gwyn sent him bound proofs of his second, entitled Amealior. If Richard had chortled his way through Summertown, he cackled and yodeled his way through Amealior. Its cuteness, its blandness, its naively pompous semicolons, its freedom from humor and incident, its hand-me-down imagery, almost endearing transparency of its little color schemes, its tinker toy symmetries. What was it about, Amealior? It wasn't autobiographical. It was about a group of fair-minded young people who, in an unnamed country, strove to establish a rural community. And they succeeded. And then it ended. Not worth writing in the first place. The finished book was, in Richard's view, a ridiculous failure. He was impatient for publication day. Thank you.
I think the first time I met Martin Amis, I was in my 20s, and I stumbled into a dinner of all his ex-girlfriends. And Isabel took me aside and she said, "Sit down, you're my only friend here tonight." The years passed, 20 years. I read him obsessively. I read him because I loved that he was a kind of bearer of literary memory, and he was so troubled by the ghosts of people who'd gone before, and that ability of his to connect literary cultures, to sort of draw lines, was very, very important to me. The last time I met him, V.S. Naipaul had just died, and he wanted to know everything about it. And I could tell that there was just something that need for information, that need to kind of make a whole of the past, was something that mattered tremendously to him. And these writers, that he always used to, he wrote, the artist critic is always a kind of secret proselytizer for his own work. He's always a secret agent. And I think he came alive through these people that he wrote about. And I wanted to read a tiny bit of the sort of, that was the other wonderful thing, was that there were all the insights about writing were through these touchstones. And so here he is on Bello. If the writer is made up of three different beings, literature, innocent, every man, then the innocent is very strong in Saul Bello. Despite great learning, experience, and nous, this is how he does it as a writer. He runs everything past his innocence, his nether mind, his first soul. On Naipaul, there is a fashionable temptation to see history as a process of helplessness, of blind movement. Naipaul does not submit to this. He thinks that everyone has choices to make, even if they haven't made them yet, and probably never will. Here he is on Nabokov. The common conception of how novels get written seems to me to be an exact description of writer's block. In the common view, the writer is at this stage so desperate that he's sitting around with a list of characters, a list of themes, and a framework for his plot, and ostensibly trying to mesh the three elements. In fact, it's never like that. What happens is what Nabokov describes as a throb or a glimmer, an act of recognition on the writer's part. At this stage, the writer thinks, here is something I can write a novel about. In the absence of that recognition, I don't know what one would do. It may be that nothing about this idea, or glimmer, or throb, appeals to you other than the fact that it's your destiny, that it's your next book. I want to end with kind of heartbreakingly Amos on Amos from the Inside Story. I attempted this book more than a decade ago, and I failed. At that point, it was provisionally and pretentiously entitled Life, and coyly subtitled A Novel. One weekend in Uruguay in 2005, I strong-armed myself into reading the whole thing, from the first word to the last. There were about 100,000 of them, and life was dead. That I'd apparently wasted about 30 months spent plodding around a muddy graveyard was the least of it. I thought I was finished. I really did. And as if seeking confirmation, this was in Uruguay, in the northerly village of José Ignacio near Maldonado, not far from the Brazilian border, I walked down to the shore and sat on a rock with my notebook, as I quite often did, the inrushing South Atlantic, the bold as the size and shape of slumbering dinosaurs, the lighthouse solid against the babyish pale blue of the sky, and I wrote not a syllable. The scene prompted nothing in me. I thought I was finished. A horribly unfamiliar sensation, a kind of anti-afflatus. When a novel comes to you, there is a familiar but always surprising sense of calorific infusion. You feel blessed, strengthened, and gorgeously reassured. But now the tide was going the other way. Something within me appeared to be subtracted. It was receding with its hand at its lips, bidding adieu. Naturally, I confessed to Elena about the demise of life, a novel, but I confessed to no one about being finished. And I wasn't finished. It was just life I couldn't write. Still, I'll never forget that feeling, that outsurge of essence. Writers die twice, and on the beach I was thinking, here it comes, the first death. Any minute now I'll tell you about a perverse mental period I went through in early middle age, and I often wonder whether it had much to do with that nadir or climacteric on the shore, that vertiginous plunge in self-belief. I think not, because the perversity predated it and went on beyond it. Yes, but these things take a long time coming and a long time going.
I'm Nathan Heller.
A surprising amount of Martin Amos's work is to do with entering slowly into nightmares, and I realized on my way here that I was entering the classic American one of appearing on stage alongside extremely charming people with British accents. So I hope you'll bear with me. Charm in writing is a different thing. Like all writers, I'm an attentive and ruthless student of charm on the page, and of the way in the best material it is woven through the more ambitious properties of writing, like the astounding purple thread through one of those beautiful brown British tweeds. Charm, don't get me wrong, is plenty ambitious on its own, like most of the effortless seeming qualities in writing. Charm is really hard to achieve, and unlike a lot of the higher refined qualities, it can't be imagined into being. It can't be faked. Martin Amos, I think, was also a fascinated student of charm. How charm can be manipulative. Why some writers have it, and other infinitely more intelligent and artful writers don't, and end up writing book reviews. Why monsters and low lives can often be the most charming of all characters, and why not even charm redeems a rotten core. The common phrase, I think it's an Amosian phrase, is charm offensive, which is one of those American idioms on the order of time is money, which contains the seeds of its own futility. Charm offensive. It conquers as it offends. And it offends as it conquers. So many books now I read now seem to be on a charm offensive. No one could ever accuse a Martin Amos novel of being on a charm offensive, and yet Amos is one of the most actually charming writers I know. Unlike probably most people here, I think everyone here, I never knew Martin, the person, so I can brag of being unseduced by the famous personal charm. But in the way of all of us here, I knew him as a writer, which is the way I suspect that writers would most like to be known. Otherwise, as Richard Toll so vividly reminded us, you would be left with a life. The Amos charm for me, for all of us, I imagine, begins at the moment we get our hands on an Amos novel, which it feels like unwrapping a present. And why is that, I wonder? I had this experience at the height of the pandemic,
with inside story, a deeply strange, slightly precarious book like so many of his best ones, like a gray-haired person walking with alarming speed down an extraordinarily steep hill. I read it with delight. All but the longest of the Amos novels, it seems to me, I've read in one evening. Some of the charm, I think, comes from his generosity to the reader, the idea that it's the work of the author to give everything all the time, the bellow-like excess of energy and voice, the Nabokovian wit and language play was near near his idea of the heart of the art, and part of what gives his novels their unwrapping pleasure. But part also comes from alertness, the kind that makes his portraits of American life more astute and to the point than any American could manage. Amos was a realist in attention, if not by style, a careful observer of our times, and on the page, he offered realism with the saturation turned up. This gave his work a kind of haunting foresight, for which prescience seems too gentle a word. It was Amos, after all, who gave us the guy on Broadway screaming, "It's my money and I want it," and who said his hair was that special mad yellow, like an omelet. And that was in 1984. Some of the charm comes from Amos's belief that the most important person in a novel was the person coming at the paper with a pen. He was our leading voice for the idea that sitting down at the desk every day was the highest calling that a person could have, and that I know was an inspiration to a lot of us. The undertone of all his writing is joy in the art of writing itself. At the top, of course, is humor, another charm. The most really great writers are in some way funny writers, but different writers produce different kinds of laughs. From Dickens, perhaps we get a chuckle. Tolstoy gives us the smile and the letting out of breath. Proust often has us laughing through our teeth. With Amos, there's this very peculiar ecstatic snicker that comes out of nowhere, uncontrollable and very high in the head. It's the laugh we get from the character who, in the rewind action of Time's Arrow, takes toys away from happy babies and slowly backs away with a grin. Or in the character who offers his own small children, quote, a near eternity of unmonitored delectation, followed by an outing to a dog shit park. At some point, I realized there's one other writer who gives us exactly the same laugh, and that writer is Kingsley Amis. Martin and his father were very different novelists with probably very different kinds of humor. But the laugh, the physical response that their work produces in readers is the same. It's a somatic line of literary happiness. Joy, alertness, generosity, humor. These are all things that can't be faked, and I think they're near the heart of Amis's irresistible charm. And for those of us, his readers, that charm is a thing to celebrate, and now more than ever, I think, to hope for. Thank you.
Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Martin used to host a poker game. The players included philosophers, biographers, novelists, critics, all sorts of literary riffraff. The most impressive aspect of these poker nights was that nobody was allowed to talk about anything except the game in progress. If some unwise person chose to mention contemporary events or to ask the participants about their forthcoming books or to make general conversation, Martin was always the first to bark, "Play cards!" This was a lesson in the world according to Martin. Pay attention to the matter in hand. Do what's in front of you to be done. Eschew all distractions. There's money on the table. Are you going to see me, raise, or fold? These are the issues before us. Let's not get sidetracked. The issues before Martin got bigger as he progressed. I loved the genius for social comedy that he revealed in his early books, and was happy to see it return in an undervalued late work, Lionel Asbo, in which I was particularly drawn to the dangerous dogs who barked like this, "Fuck off, fuck off." I think this may have been a joke Martin stole from his father, Kingsley, who liked such jokes. As I said, Martin found that he had bigger fish to fry than social comedy. As time went on, he aimed his quill at nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union more than once, Islamic terrorism, and the Holocaust more than once. Like Daniel and other speakers, I greatly admired his 1991 novel, Time's Arrow, which reverses the timeline of Holocaust history like a film reel running in reverse magazine, so that in the camps of the Third Reich, we encounter, for example, thoughtful Nazi dentists who kindly fill the dental cavities of their Jewish patients with gold fillings, the blackest of black jokes. Time's Arrow was the only novel Martin wrote that was a finalist for the Booker Prize. It didn't win. Ben Okri did that year with The Famished Road. And afterwards, I recall Martin saying that he wished his book had not been shortlisted, because then he would have had a perfect record. When Martin, Ian McEwan, and I were all still living in London, before I moved to Manhattan, Martin and Isabel came to Brooklyn, and Ian and Annalena bought their house in the country. We used to have regular dinners together, usually at a restaurant called Elena's L'Etoile on Charlotte Street. These evenings took on added meaning when a British Sunday newspaper published a composite photograph of the three of us under the headline, "The Godfathers." Well, we thought, if we are the book capi, the heads of the city's literary crime families, we should probably keep meeting from time to time to preserve the peace, and prevent gang wars from breaking out between the various literary mafias. So at Elena's L'Etoile, we tried to solve the problems of the literary world with, I must say, considerable success. The story of the word games we played with Christopher Hitchens has perhaps been told too many times. But in case there are a few people here who haven't heard it, I'll tell it once more. We invented the game of titles of books, films, songs that didn't quite make it. For Whom the Bell Rings. A Farewell to Weapons. Mr. Zhivago. A Passage to Bangladesh. Toby Dick. 2 days in the life of Ivan Denisovich. Tender as the Evening. Florence of Arabia. Mr. Tangerine Man. And Hitch 22, which in the end Christopher turned into a real book, his autobiography, launched in 2010 in this very place. Martin and Christopher were responsible for the more scandalous game, in which the word love was replaced by the phrase hysterical sex. Hysterical sex in the time of cholera. All you need is hysterical sex. Bye-bye, hysterical sex. My hysterical sex is like a red, red rose, etc. There are writers whose voice is unmistakable. Ernest Hemingway, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Toni Morrison. Martin, too, from the beginning, had a literary voice you could recognize without being told who the author was. He believed, as all good writers believe, that literature begins at the level of the sentence. But I would add that in his case, literature flowered at the level of the paragraph. Martin was a master of paragraphs that ranted and riffed rhythmically, unforgettably, about anything. This is from Money. This is John Self in New York City. Things happen to me. They do. They just have to go ahead and happen. You watch, you wait. Things still happen here. You step off the plane, look around, take a deep breath, and come to in your underpants, somewhere south of Soho, or on a midtown traction table with a silver tray and a tasseled tab on your chest and a guy in white saying, "Good morning, sir. How are you today? That'll be $15,000. Things still happen here, and something is waiting to happen to me. I can tell. Recently, my life feels like a blood-curdling joke. Recently, my life has taken on form. Something is waiting. I am waiting. Soon it will stop waiting. Any day now. Awful things can happen any time. This is the awful thing." My wife, Rachel Eliza Griffiths, and I saw Martin and Isabel twice in late 2022. First at the end of October at the home of close mutual friends, where Martin and I toasted each other as survivors, he of cancer, I of the knife. And then 2 weeks later, on November the 11th, we were at his and Isabel's apartment where he seemed frailer than before. And I feared that our toast to survival might have been premature. We never saw him again. The cancer returned and he embarked on his last journey to Florida and beyond. This was the awful thing. I'm sorry that I never got to say goodbye properly. So I'll say it now. Goodbye, Martin. And I send you a lot of hysterical sex.